In the heart of Arizona, where the land stretched endlessly and the sun painted the earth in shades of gold and red, there lived a rancher named John and his daughter, Emily. Their home was nestled at the edge of a vast desert, surrounded by rolling hills and rugged mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The air carried the scent of sagebrush and wildflowers, and life moved slowly, dictated by the rhythm of nature. For as long as she could remember, Emily had been inseparable from this land. She grew up riding horses bareback, chasing cattle, across open plains and listening to her father's stories about the old days when settlers first came to this untamed wilderness. Emily was not like other girls her age. At 16, she was strong-willed and fearless, with a spirit as untamed as the land around her. Her golden brown hair fell in loose waves down her back, and her green eyes sparkled with curiosity. She loved nothing more than exploring the countryside, on horseback, feeling the wind rush against her face as she galloped through fields of tall grass. But even though she felt free as a bird, her father often warned her to stay close to home. "The world out there isn't always kind," he would say, his voice heavy with concern. "Especially now." Those words held weight, for tensions between settlers and Native American tribes were high. The Apache, a proud and resourceful people, fiercely defended their lands against encroaching settlers. Skirmishes broke out frequently, and fear lingered in the hearts of many who lived near the borderlands. John tried his best to shield Emily from these dangers, but she couldn't help but feel drawn to the mystery of the Apache. From a distance, she had seen glimpses of their camps, smoke rising from fires, figures moving silently under the cover of trees. But she knew little about them beyond the stories told by frightened neighbors. One crisp autumn morning, Emily woke early, eager to begin her chores. The sky was still tinged with pink as she saddled her horse, Starlight, and set off toward the pasture where the cattle grazed. Dew clung to the blades of grass, glinting like diamonds in the soft light. Birds chirped overhead, and the world seemed peaceful, untouched by the troubles that plagued it. As she rode along the fence line, checking for any signs of damage, Emily allowed herself to daydream. She imagined what it might be like to live completely free, without boundaries or rules, just like the Apache she'd heard so much about. But her reverie was shattered when she noticed movement in the distance. At first, she thought it was one of the ranch hands coming to check on her, but as she squinted against the rising sun, her stomach tightened. There, emerging from the shadows of the trees, were several figures on horseback. They wore leather breeches and brightly colored blankets draped over their shoulders, their faces painted with streaks of red and black. Emily's heart began to race. She recognized them instantly. They were Apache warriors. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Emily froze, her fingers gripping the reins tightly. Part of her wanted to turn Starlight around and race back to the safety of the ranch, but another part of her, the stubborn, curious part, held her ground. She reminded herself that they hadn't done anything yet. Maybe they weren't here to harm her. Slowly, she raised her hand in a gesture of peace, hoping they would understand. But instead of responding, the warriors exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them pointed toward her, and before she could react, they spurred their horses forward, closing the distance between them in seconds. Panic surged through Emily as she realized she wouldn't be able to outrun them. Starlight was fast, but the warriors' horses were bred for speed and endurance. With no other choice, she kicked her heels into Starlight's sides and took off, leaning low over the horse's neck as they thundered across the open plain. Behind her, she could hear the pounding of hooves growing louder, the shouts of the warriors ringing in her ears. Her mind raced with thoughts of her father, of the life she might never see again. Tears blurred her vision as she pushed Starlight harder, urging him to go faster. Despite her efforts, the warriors quickly gained on her. Just as she reached the edge of a rocky ravine, one of them lunged forward, grabbing hold of Starlight's bridle. The horse reared up, throwing Emily off balance. She tumbled to the ground, landing hard on the dusty earth. Pain shot through her body, but she didn't have time to recover. Strong hands grabbed her arms, pulling her to her feet. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. The warriors were too strong, their grip unyielding. As they bound her wrists with strips of leather, Emily caught sight of something that made her blood run cold, a flash of steel glinting in the sunlight. One of the warriors carried a knife, its blade sharp and menacing. Fear gripped her heart as she wondered what they intended to do with her. Would they hurt her, kill her, or worse, take her far away from everything she knew? Her mind raced with questions, but no answers came. When the warriors finally mounted their horses, dragging Emily along with them, she looked back one last time at the land she called home. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of the ranch house, standing small and lonely against the vast horizon. Her father would come looking for her, she told herself. He wouldn't give up until he found her. But deep down, she wasn't sure if anyone could save her now. As the warriors disappeared into the dense forest, leaving behind only a trail of dust, Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was alone, a prisoner in a world she didn't understand, with no idea what the future held. The journey into Apache territory was long and grueling. Emily's captors said little, their faces stoic as they guided their horses through winding trails and treacherous terrain. She rode double with one of the warriors, her hands tied securely behind her back. Every bump and jolt sent sharp pains through her body, but she bit her tongue, refusing to cry out. She didn't want to show weakness, not to these men who already saw her as nothing more than a prize or a bargaining chip. Hours passed and the landscape changed dramatically. The open plains gave way to towering cliffs and narrow canyons, their walls jagged and imposing. The air grew cooler as they ascended, higher into the mountains, and soon Emily found herself surrounded by thick pine forests that blocked out the sunlight. It was a stark contrast to the wide open spaces she was used to, and the unfamiliarity of it all left her feeling disoriented and scared. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of orange and purple, they arrived at their destination. Nestled in a secluded valley was an Apache encampment, its presence both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Tents made of animal hides dotted the area, and smoke curled lazily into the evening sky from cooking fires. Children played nearby, laughing and shouting while women worked diligently, preparing food and mending clothes. Warriors stood guard at the edges of the camp, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Emily was led to the center of the encampment, where an elder man sat cross-legged on a woven mat. His hair was streaked with gray and his face bore the lines of someone who had lived a long and difficult life. He regarded her with piercing eyes, studying her as if trying to decipher some hidden truth. Around him, the warriors spoke in hushed tones, gesturing animatedly as they recounted the events of the day. Emily couldn't understand their words, but the tone of their voices sent chills down her spine. After what felt like an eternity, the elder nodded, and the warriors dragged her to a tent on the outskirts of the camp. Inside, the space was sparse, furnished only with a few blankets and a small fire pit. They untied her hands and left her alone, the flap of the tent closing behind them with a swish. For the first time since her capture, Emily allowed herself to cry. She curled up on the hard ground, wrapping her arms around her knees as sobs racked her body. The reality of her situation hit her like a tidal wave. She was miles away from home, surrounded by people who viewed her as an enemy, and completely at their mercy. But as the tears subsided, and the initial shock wore off, Emily realized something important. She was still alive. Whatever fate awaited her, she vowed to face it with courage. She may have been taken from her home, but she refused to let fear break her. Little did she know, her resilience would catch the attention of someone unexpected, someone who would change the course of her life forever. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's life in the Apache encampment became a mix of monotony and tension. At first, she spent most of her time confined to the small tent on the edge of the camp, watched closely by warriors who seemed unsure of what to do with her. She wasn't allowed to wander freely, and any attempt to speak or communicate was met with silence or stern looks. The language barrier felt like an invisible wall between her and the people around her, leaving her isolated and frustrated. But as time went on, she began to notice subtle changes in how some of the Apaches treated her. The women of the camp were the first to show signs of curiosity rather than hostility. They would glance at her from afar, their expressions softening, when they saw her sitting quietly in the shade of her tent. One day, an older woman approached her with a bowl of stew made from wild game and herbs. Emily hesitated at first, unsure if she should accept it, but hunger eventually overcame her fear. She took the bowl with trembling hands and nodded in. Thanks, though she couldn't find the words to express her gratitude. The woman smiled faintly before walking away, leaving Emily feeling both confused and grateful. As days passed, more interactions like this began to occur. Some of the younger children would peek into her tent, giggling and whispering among themselves before running off. Occasionally, one of the braver ones would toss a small object, a carved wooden figurine or a piece of colorful beadwork, into her tent before scampering away. These gestures, though small, gave Emily a glimmer of hope. Maybe not everyone here saw her as an enemy after all. Among the warriors, however, attitudes remained divided. Most continued to regard her with suspicion, their eyes following her every move whenever she ventured outside the tent. But there was one warrior who stood out from the rest. His name was Nantan, and he was different from the others in ways that Emily couldn't quite put into words. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than her, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to hold a depth of thoughtfulness rarely seen in the other men. Unlike his peers who often sneered or ignored her, Nantan observed her with quiet interest, his gaze lingering just long enough to make her feel noticed, but never threatened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the camp settled into its nightly routine, Nantan approached Emily's tent. She had been sitting outside staring at the stars and trying to memorize their patterns so she wouldn't forget them. When she saw him coming, her heart skipped a beat. She tensed, unsure of what to expect. Would he demand something from her, or worse, taunt her for being a prisoner? To her surprise, Nantan stopped a few paces away and simply stood there watching her. After a moment, he knelt down and placed a small bundle on the ground between them. It contained dried meat, nuts, and a handful of berries. Food far better than the scraps she usually received. Emily looked up at him, her green eyes wide with confusion. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. Nantan tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. Then, in halting English, he replied, "You, strong." His accent was thick, but his meaning was clear. Emily blinked, startled by his words. No one had ever called her strong before, at least, not in this context. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Over the next few days, Nantan continued to visit her, always bringing small gifts or sharing bits of knowledge about the camp. He taught her how to identify edible plants growing near the tents and showed her how to weave simple baskets using strips of bark and grass. Though their conversations were limited by language, they found ways to communicate through gestures and facial expressions. Slowly but surely, a fragile bond began to form between them. Emily soon discovered that Nantan was not only kind, but also deeply conflicted about her captivity. During one of their encounters, he pointed toward the distant mountains and said, "Your people, come fight." His tone was heavy with regret, and Emily could see the weight of his words in his eyes. She realized then that he understood the pain caused by the ongoing conflict between settlers and Native Americans. He didn't agree with everything his clan did, and his actions toward her were a quiet rebellion against the hatred that fueled so much of their world. Despite his kindness, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was still a prisoner. The ropes binding her wrists may have loosened, but the invisible chains of captivity remained. Every night as she lay awake in her tent, she dreamed of freedom. She imagined herself riding starlight across the open plains, the wind rushing past her face as she raced toward home. Sometimes she even pictured Nantan riding beside her, his dark hair flowing in the breeze as they escaped together. These dreams kept her going, giving her the strength to endure each new day. One afternoon, while helping a group of women grind corn near the fire pit, Emily overheard fragments of a heated conversation. Several warriors were gathered nearby, their voices rising as they argued about the presence of a white captive in their midst. Some believed she should be used as leverage in negotiations with the settlers, while others thought it was too dangerous to keep her alive. Emily's heart sank as she listened, realizing that her fate was still uncertain. The arguments grew louder, drawing the attention of the entire camp. Even Nantan joined the discussion, his expression tense as he spoke passionately in defense of keeping her safe. Though Emily couldn't understand everything they said, she caught enough to realize that Nantan was risking his standing within the tribe to protect her. He argued that harming her would only deepen the divide between their peoples, making peace impossible. His words carried weight, and after a long debate, the elders reluctantly agreed to let her stay. For now. But the decision came with conditions. She would have to prove her worth by contributing to the camp and earning their trust. That night, as Emily sat alone in her tent, she felt a surge of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was relieved to know that she wasn't in immediate danger. On the other hand, the realization that her survival depended on proving herself to her captors filled her with frustration and sadness. Yet amidst all the turmoil, one thought brought her comfort. Nantan had chosen to stand by her side, even when it meant defying his own people. In that moment, she knew she wasn't entirely alone. As the days stretched on, Emily threw herself into learning the ways of the Apache. She worked tirelessly, determined to earn their respect. She learned how to track animals by studying their footprints and listening for subtle sounds in the forest. She practiced shooting arrows under Nantan's guidance, her aim improving with each attempt. She even picked up bits of their language, piecing together phrases that allowed her to communicate more effectively. With each new skill she mastered, she felt a little less like a prisoner and a little more like part of the community. But despite her progress, Emily never forgot where she truly belonged. Late at night, when the camp fell silent and the stars shone brightly overhead, she would close her eyes and picture her father's face. She imagined him searching for her, refusing to give up until he found her. And she promised herself that no matter what happened, she would find a way back to him. For now, though, she focused on surviving and on the growing connection she shared with Nantan. Little did she know, their bond would soon lead to a choice neither of them could have anticipated. Emily's days in the Apache camp grew more predictable, yet each one brought new challenges and discoveries. She had earned a small measure of trust from some of the women and children, who now greeted her with nods or shy smiles as she passed by. Her hands were no longer bound, though she knew escape was impossible without help. The warriors kept a close watch on her, their eyes sharp and unyielding. Still, Emily found solace in the routine of daily life, grinding corn, gathering firewood, and practicing skills like weaving and archery under Nantan's patient guidance. Nantan became a constant presence in her life. He visited her tent almost every evening, bringing food or small tokens of kindness. Sometimes he would sit silently beside her, staring at the stars or listening to the sounds of the night. Other times he tried to teach her words in his language, pointing to objects around them and repeating their names until she could mimic the sounds. His patience amazed her. Even when she stumbled over pronunciation, he never laughed or grew frustrated. Instead, he smiled faintly, encouraging her to try again. Their connection deepened as they spent more time together. One afternoon, while teaching her how to start a fire using flint and tinder, Nantan paused and looked at her intently. "You different," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. Emily tilted her head, unsure what he meant. "Not like others," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the distant mountains where settlers lived. At first, Emily wasn't sure how to respond. Was he complimenting her? Or was he simply stating a fact? But as she thought about it, she realized he was right. She was different, not just from the settlers, but also from the Apache. She didn't fully belong to either world, caught somewhere in between. It was a lonely feeling, but it also made her special. Nantan seemed to see that, and for the first time since her capture, Emily felt truly understood. Despite their growing bond, there were moments when reality came crashing down, reminding her of her captivity. One day, while helping carry water from the nearby stream, Emily overheard two warriors talking about her. Their voices were low, but anger simmered beneath their words. "She stays too long," one muttered. "She brings trouble." The other nodded grimly. "If her people come, we will pay for keeping her." Emily's stomach churned as she listened. She knew they weren't wrong. The longer she stayed, the greater the risk of violence. Her father must have been searching for her relentlessly, and if he ever found this place, bloodshed would surely follow. The thought terrified her. She didn't want anyone to get hurt because of her. Not her father, not the Apache, and certainly not Nantan. That night, as she lay awake in her tent, Emily wrestled with her emotions. She wanted to go home, but she also didn't want to leave Nantan behind. He had become her anchor in this strange and hostile world, the one person who treated her with kindness and respect. If she left, what would happen to him? Would his clan punish him for helping her? The question swirled in her mind, keeping her awake long after the camp fell silent. The next morning, Nantan arrived earlier than usual. His expression was unusually serious, and he carried a bundle wrapped in animal hide. Without saying a word, he handed it to her and motioned for her to open it. Inside, she found a warm blanket, a pouch of dried meat, and a small knife with a bone handle. Confusion washed over her as she looked up at him. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Nantan hesitated, his dark eyes filled with conflict. Finally, he spoke in broken English. "You must go," he said firmly, though his tone betrayed his reluctance. "Soon, before it is too late." Emily's heart sank. "Go where?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. He wanted her to escape, to run back to her father and leave this place behind. But how could she do that alone? And how could she leave him? "You cannot stay here forever," Nantan continued, his voice softening. "They will not let you live. Not if your people come." He pointed toward the mountains again, his hand shaking slightly. "I can show you the way. At night, when everyone sleeps." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. She wanted to argue, to tell him she couldn't leave him behind. But deep down she knew he was right. Staying meant risking not only her life but also the lives of those around her. Escape was the only option, but it was a dangerous one. Over the next few days, Nantan began preparing her for the journey. He taught her how to navigate the trails leading out of the valley, showing her landmarks like peculiar rock formations and clusters of tall pine trees. He explained which plants were safe to eat and which animals to avoid. Every lesson felt like a step closer to freedom and farther away from the life she had grown accustomed to. On the eve of their planned escape, Emily sat outside her tent staring at the stars. Nantan joined her, sitting quietly beside her as they both struggled to find the right words. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Helping me. Risking everything. Why?" Nantan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment he didn't answer. Then in a voice barely above a whisper he said, "Because you deserve better. Because I believe peace is possible. Someday." His words struck a chord deep within her. Peace. It seemed like such an impossible dream in a world torn apart by hatred and fear. Yet hearing Nantan speak of it gave her hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness. The hours dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. As midnight approached, Nantan signaled for Emily to follow him. They moved silently through the sleeping camp, sticking to the shadows to avoid detection. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. She clutched the bundle Nantan had given her, its weight grounding her as they crept past tents and sleeping figures. When they reached the edge of the camp, Nantan stopped and turned to face her. In the dim moonlight, his features were shadowed, but his eyes shone with determination. "This is where we part," he said quietly. "Follow the trail I showed you. Do not stop until you reach the river. From there you will know the way." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "Come with me, please." Nantan hesitated, pain flashing across his face. "I cannot," he said finally. "My place is here, but you must go, for both our sakes." Before she could protest further, he pressed something into her hand, a small wooden carving of a bird. "Take this," he said, "so you remember." Emily stared at the carving, her fingers trembling as she closed them around it. She wanted to say so many things, to thank him, to beg him to change his mind, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying out loud. With one final glance at Nantan, she turned and began walking down the trail, her steps heavy with emotion. She didn't look back, knowing that if she did, she might lose her resolve. Behind her, she heard the faint rustle of leaves as Nantan disappeared into the night, returning to the life he had chosen, and leaving her to forge a new path. As she walked, the enormity of what she had lost hit her all at once. Nantan had saved her not just from captivity but from despair. He had shown her kindness when no one else would, and now he had given her the chance to reclaim her freedom. But the cost of that freedom weighed heavily on her heart. She clutched the wooden bird tightly, vowing never to forget the boy who had defied his clan to save her. For hours, Emily followed the trail, guided by the landmarks Nantan had described. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath her feet and the occasional hoot of an owl. Fear gnawed at her, but she pushed forward, driven by the memory of Nantan's sacrifice. Finally, just as dawn began to break, she reached the river. The sight of the rushing water brought a surge of relief and dread. Beyond this point, she would be truly alone, navigating unfamiliar territory without Nantan's guidance. Taking a deep breath, she waded into the shallows and began following the current downstream, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of home. Though she didn't know it yet, her journey was far from over. The road ahead would test her courage, resilience, and faith in ways she couldn't imagine. But one thing was certain: Nantan's act of defiance had changed her forever, planting a seed of hope in a world divided by hatred. And as long as she carried that hope and the tiny wooden bird in her heart, she knew she could face whatever lay ahead. The river stretched endlessly before Emily, its waters glinting in the pale morning light. She walked along its banks, her feet sinking into the soft mud as she followed the current downstream. The bundle Nantan had given her was slung over her shoulder, its weight both comforting and burdensome. Inside were supplies meant to sustain her, but they also reminded her of everything she had left behind, especially him. Each step took her farther from the Apache camp, yet his presence lingered, in her mind like a shadow. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the air grew warmer and Emily's body began to ache from hours of walking. Her throat was dry and hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she forced herself to keep moving. Stopping felt too much like giving up, and she couldn't afford that. Not now. Every so often, she glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see warriors chasing after her. But the trail remained empty, silent except for the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. By midday, Emily reached a rocky outcrop that jutted into the river. She paused there, dropping to her knees to drink deeply from the cool water. As she splashed it onto her face, she noticed something etched into one of the stones, a crude arrow pointing eastward. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this another sign? From Nantan? Or just a coincidence? Either way, it gave her direction, something tangible to focus on as she continued her journey. Following the arrow's guidance, Emily veered away from the river and into the dense forest beyond. The terrain quickly became uneven, with roots twisting across the ground and low-hanging branches snagging at her clothes. Progress slowed, but she pressed on, driven by the thought of reuniting with her father. She imagined his face lighting up when he saw her, imagined the warmth of his embrace after so many weeks apart. That image kept her going, even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Night fell swiftly, blanketing the forest in darkness. Emily found shelter beneath a cluster of boulders, curling up with the blanket Nantan had given her. It smelled faintly of smoke and earth, a reminder of the life she had left behind. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of running through endless woods pursued by unseen figures. When she woke at dawn, her body stiff and sore, she wondered if escaping had been worth the pain. Then she remembered Nantan's sacrifice and pushed those doubts aside. On the second day of her journey, Emily encountered her first real challenge, a steep ravine cutting across her path. The sides were jagged and unstable, littered with loose rocks that shifted underfoot. Climbing down seemed impossible, but going around would take hours, and time was something she didn't have. Taking a deep breath, she lowered herself carefully, clinging to tree roots and outcroppings for support. Her hands scraped against rough bark, and her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to give up. Halfway down, her foot slipped, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling into the abyss below. For a terrifying moment, she hung suspended, her fingers clutching desperately at a narrow ledge. Tears streamed down her face as she pulled herself back up inch by inch, finally collapsing onto solid ground at the bottom. Shaken but alive, Emily pressed onward, determined not to let fear slow her down. The landscape began to change as she moved deeper into unfamiliar territory. The thick forest gave way to open plains dotted with scrub brush and cacti. The air turned drier, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. It was a harsh environment, but it felt familiar somehow, a piece of home calling out to her. On the third night, as she rested beneath a star-filled sky, Emily heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the distant howl of wolves. At first she told herself it was nothing to worry about. They were miles away hunting their own prey. But as the minutes passed, the howls grew louder, closer. Panic bubbled up inside her, urging her to flee. But she knew running blindly in the dark would only make things worse. Instead, she gathered dry twigs and leaves, building a small fire to ward off predators. The flames flickered weakly at first, but soon they roared to life, casting a warm glow around her makeshift campsite. For hours, she sat huddled near the fire, listening to the wolves circling just beyond the light. Their glowing eyes reflected eerily in the darkness, watching her every move. Emily gripped the knife Nantan had given her, her knuckles white as she prepared to defend herself if necessary. But the wolves never attacked. They stayed just out of reach, their haunting cries echoing through the night until finally fading away as dawn approached. When the sun rose, Emily extinguished the fire and resumed her journey, her nerves still frayed from the encounter. The plains stretched endlessly before her, barren and desolate, but she pressed on, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. By mid-morning, she spotted something in the distance, a lone figure on horseback, silhouetted against the horizon. Her heart leapt with hope. Could it be her father? Or perhaps another settler searching for her? She waved her arms frantically, shouting as loudly as she could. The figure turned toward her, spurring their horse into a gallop. As they drew closer, Emily's excitement turned to dread. It wasn't a settler. It was an Apache scout, his painted face and feathered headdress unmistakable. He must have been sent to track her down, to bring her back to the camp. Fear surged through her veins as she realized she had no chance of outrunning him on foot. Desperation drove her to act. Remembering Nantan's lessons, she scanned the area for anything she could use to defend herself. Nearby, she spotted a fallen branch, sturdy enough to serve as a weapon. Gripping it tightly, she stood her ground, her legs trembling but resolute. The scout slowed his horse, studying her with narrowed eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved, locked in a tense standoff. Then, without warning, the scout raised his bow, an arrow knocked and aimed directly at her. Emily froze, her mind racing. This was it, the end of her journey, the price of her defiance. She closed her eyes, bracing for impact, but the arrow never came. Instead, she heard the thunderous sound of hooves approaching fast. Opening her eyes, she saw another rider charging toward them, shouting in Apache. It was Nantan, his expression fierce as he confronted the scout. The two men exchanged heated words, their voices rising angrily. Emily watched in stunned silence, unsure what to do. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the scout lowered his bow and turned his horse around, disappearing into the distance. Nantan dismounted and rushed to Emily's side, his chest heaving with exertion. "You should not have come," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "It is too dangerous." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't go back," she whispered. "I won't." Nantan hesitated, his eyes filled with conflict. Then with a heavy sigh he nodded. "We must hurry," he said. "They will send more." Without another word, he helped Emily onto his horse, climbing up behind her. Together, they rode hard, across the plains, leaving the scout far behind. The journey was grueling, each mile marked by tension and uncertainty. But for the first time since her escape, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. Nantan was with her now, and somehow, that made all the difference. As they traveled, Emily clung to him, her mind racing with questions. Why had he come after her? What would happen if they were caught? And most importantly, where were they going? She wanted to ask, but the urgency of their situation silenced her. For now, all that mattered was survival. By nightfall, they reached a secluded canyon, its towering walls shielding them from prying eyes. Nantan tethered the horse and started a small fire, its light barely visible from outside the canyon. They sat close together, sharing the meager food from Emily's bundle. Neither spoke much. Words felt unnecessary in the face of everything, unsaid between them. As the fire crackled softly, Emily looked at Nantan, her heart swelling with gratitude and guilt. He had risked everything to save her, not once but twice, and now he was risking even more by helping her escape again. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Nantan stared into the flames, his expression somber. "Because I believe in you," he said simply, "and because I believe in peace." His words struck a chord deep within her, filling her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. Maybe her journey wasn't just about returning home. Maybe it was about proving that peace was possible, even in a world torn apart by hatred and fear. With Nantan by her side, Emily vowed to keep fighting, for herself, for him, and for the future they both dreamed of. The canyon provided temporary refuge, but Emily and Nantan knew they couldn't stay there for long. The Apache scout would report back to the clan, and it was only a matter of time before more warriors came looking for them. Every moment they lingered increased the danger, not just for themselves but for anyone who might cross their path. Before sunrise, they packed up their meager supplies and set off again, riding steadily eastward toward the edge of Apache territory. As they traveled, Emily found herself marveling at Nantan's resourcefulness. He navigated the rugged landscape with ease, choosing trails that were nearly invisible to the untrained eye. At one point, he led them through a narrow passageway between two cliffs, its entrance hidden by thick clusters of brush. Inside, the air was cool and damp, and the sound of dripping water echoed softly around them. Emily felt as though they were moving through a secret world, unseen and untouched by others. It was both thrilling and unnerving, a reminder of how far removed they were from the lives they had left behind. Despite the constant threat of pursuit, there were moments of quiet connection between them. During brief stops to rest or water the horse, Nantan shared stories about his childhood, how he had learned to hunt and track animals, how he had once gotten lost in these very mountains and been rescued by an elder who taught him survival skills. His voice was calm and steady, painting vivid pictures of a life tied deeply to the land. Emily listened intently, asking questions when she could find the right words. In return, she told him about her own upbringing on the ranch, describing the endless fields, the cattle, and the freedom she had taken for granted before her capture. They laughed together at small things, a funny memory, an awkward translation, and for those fleeting moments, the weight of their situation seemed to lift. But reality always returned, often in sharp and unexpected ways. On the fourth day of their journey, as they crested a hill overlooking a wide valley, they spotted smoke rising in the distance. At first, Emily thought it might be a settler's camp, a sign that they were nearing safety. Her heart raced with hope as she urged Nantan to investigate. But as they drew closer, the truth became painfully clear. It wasn't settlers making the fire. It was another group of Apache warriors, their horses tethered nearby and their weapons glinting in the sunlight. Nantan pulled back on the reins, bringing the horse to a halt behind a cluster of rocks. His face was grim as he studied the scene below. "We cannot go around," he whispered. "They will see us." Emily's stomach churned with fear. She glanced at Nantan, searching his eyes for some kind of solution. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, then reached into his pouch and pulled out a handful of dirt. Rubbing it across his cheeks and arms, he motioned for Emily to do the same. "We blend in," he said quietly. "Act like we belong." Though terrified, Emily followed his instructions, smearing the earth over her skin until she looked less like a captive and more like someone who had been living off the land. When they were ready, Nantan guided the horse down the hill, keeping his posture relaxed and casual. As they approached the encampment, several warriors turned to look at them, their expressions wary but not immediately hostile. One of the men stepped forward, addressing Nantan in rapid-fire Apache. Emily held her breath, praying that Nantan's response would satisfy them. He spoke confidently, gesturing toward the mountains and explaining that they were tracking game. The man nodded slowly, though his eyes lingered suspiciously on Emily. After what felt like an eternity, he waved them through, allowing them to continue without further questions. Once they were safely out of sight, Emily let out a shaky breath. "That was close," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Too close," Nantan agreed, his jaw tight with tension. "We need to move faster." From that point on, they pushed themselves harder, traveling late into the night and starting early in the morning. Exhaustion gnawed at their bodies, but neither complained. Each mile brought them closer to the borderlands where settlers and Native Americans sometimes crossed paths. It was dangerous territory, fraught with suspicion and conflict, but it was also their best chance of finding help. On the 6th day, they reached a small trading post nestled in a shallow valley. The building was weathered and worn, its wooden walls splintered from years of exposure to the elements. A few wagons were parked outside, and the faint smell of livestock drifted through the air. Emily's heart leapt at the sight of it. Finally, a sign of civilization. But as they approached cautiously, she noticed something unsettling. Several armed men stood near the entrance, their rifles slung over their shoulders and their faces hard with distrust. Nantan stopped the horse a safe distance away, studying the scene carefully. "This is where we part," he said quietly, turning to face Emily. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried a note of finality. "No," Emily protested, shaking her head. "You can't leave me here, not now." "I must," Nantan replied, his tone firm yet gentle. "If they see me, they will shoot first and ask questions later. You are safer without me." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she clutched his arm. "But what about you? Where will you go?" He hesitated, then reached into his pouch and pulled out the wooden bird carving he had given her days earlier. Pressing it into her hand, he said, "Take this, remember me." Before she could argue further, he dismounted and handed her the reins. "Go," he urged, his voice breaking slightly. "Find your father. Tell him I am sorry." Emily wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, but she knew it was useless. With a heavy heart, she kicked the horse into a trot, heading toward the trading post. As she rode, she glanced back one last time, catching a glimpse of Nantan standing alone against the vast expanse of desert. His figure grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the horizon. When she reached the trading post, the men greeted her with a mix of surprise and suspicion. One of them, a grizzled trader with a scruffy beard, recognized her immediately. "Emily?" he exclaimed, his eyes widening. "Is that really you?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she slid off the horse. "Please," she choked out. "I need to get home." The trader wasted no time, ushering her inside and offering her food and water. He promised to send word to her father, who was likely still searching desperately for her. As she sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket and sipping hot tea, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. She was finally free, reunited with her own people, but the cost of that freedom weighed heavily on her heart. Days later, when her father arrived at the trading post, Emily ran into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He held her tightly, stroking her hair and murmuring reassurances. For hours they talked, sharing everything that had happened since her capture. But when Emily tried to explain Nantan's role in her escape, her father's expression darkened. "He's one of them," he said gruffly. "You should have come home sooner." Emily shook her head, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "He saved me, Father. He risked everything to help me. We owe him our thanks, not our anger." Her father didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told her he wasn't convinced. Still, Emily refused to let go of the truth. Nantan had shown her that kindness and courage existed on both sides of the divide, even in a world consumed by hatred. And though she might never see him again, she vowed to honor his sacrifice by spreading that message wherever she went. In the weeks that followed, Emily struggled to adjust to life back on the ranch. Everything felt different now. The open plains seemed smaller, the routines duller. She missed Nantan more than she cared to admit, clutching the wooden bird carving whenever loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. Yet amidst the pain, she found purpose. She began speaking to other settlers about her experiences, urging them to see the humanity in their Apache neighbors. Some listened, others dismissed her as naive. But Emily didn't care. She knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but she believed in the power of hope, and in the boy who had taught her to dream of peace. Far away, in the heart of Apache territory, Nantan faced challenges of his own. His absence during the search for Emily had raised suspicions among his clan, and whispers of betrayal followed him wherever he went. But he bore the weight of their judgment silently, knowing he had done the right thing. Though separated by miles and worlds, he and Emily remained connected by the choices they had made, a testament to the enduring strength of compassion in a fractured world. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy for Emily, though the scars of her journey remained. She tried to focus on the ranch, helping her father with chores and tending to the animals, but her mind often wandered back to Nantan. The wooden bird carving he had given her sat on a shelf in her room, a constant reminder of his bravery and sacrifice. At night, she would hold it in her hands, tracing its smooth surface as she replayed their time together in her mind. Though grateful to be home, part of her felt incomplete, as if a piece of her heart had been left behind in the desert. Her father noticed the change in her. He saw how quiet she had become, how distant her gaze was when she thought no one was watching. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, he finally broke the silence. "You miss him, don't you?" he asked gently, surprising her with his perceptiveness. Emily hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, she nodded. "I do," she admitted softly. "He saved my life, Father. More than once." Her father sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to ease an invisible ache. For weeks after her return, he had avoided talking about Nantan, dismissing him as just another Apache warrior. But seeing the pain in Emily's eyes forced him to reconsider. "Tell me more about him," he said finally, his tone softer than usual. "Help me understand." So Emily told him everything, how Nantan had defied his clan to protect her, how he had taught her survival skills and shared stories of his people, how he had risked his own safety to ensure hers. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, filled with admiration and gratitude. By the time she finished, tears glistened in her father's eyes. "I misjudged him," he admitted quietly, "and I'm sorry for that." His apology meant more to Emily than he could have known. It wasn't just about Nantan. It was about bridging the gap between two worlds that had long been at odds. If her father, a man who had spent years fearing, The Apache could open his heart to understanding, then maybe others could too. Determined to honor Nantan's courage, Emily began reaching out to other settlers, sharing her story and urging them to see beyond their prejudices. She spoke at gatherings, describing the kindness she had witnessed among the Apache and challenging the stereotypes that fueled so much hatred. Some listened intently, nodding in agreement or asking thoughtful questions. Others dismissed her, words calling her naive or foolish. But Emily refused to let their skepticism deter her. She knew change wouldn't come easily, but every conversation planted a seed of hope. Meanwhile, deep within Apache territory, Nantan faced challenges of his own. His absence during the search for Emily had not gone unnoticed, and whispers of betrayal spread through the camp like wildfire. Many accused him of siding with the enemy, while others simply regarded him with suspicion and disdain. Even some of his closest friends kept their distance, unwilling to associate with someone whose loyalty was questioned. The elders summoned him to a meeting, their faces stern as they demanded answers. "Why did you help her?" one of them asked, his voice sharp with accusation. "She is not one of us." Nantan stood tall, meeting their gazes without flinching. "She is human, like us," he replied firmly. "Would you have me turn my back on someone in need?" His response only deepened the divide. Though some elders respected his honesty, others condemned him, warning that his actions could bring danger to the tribe. In the end, they decided to banish him, not permanently, but long enough to test his resolve. They sent him to live alone, in the wilderness for a month, stripped of all but the most basic supplies. It was a harsh punishment meant to remind him of his duty to the clan. But Nantan accepted it without complaint. He understood their fears, even if he disagreed with their methods. As he packed his belongings and prepared to leave, he thought of Emily and the lessons she had unknowingly taught him. Her resilience and determination had inspired him to believe in a better future, a world where peace might one day replace conflict. That belief gave him strength, even as he ventured into solitude. The days alone in the wilderness were grueling, testing both his body and spirit. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and loneliness weighed heavily on his heart. Yet each sunrise brought a renewed sense of purpose. He spent hours reflecting on his choices, reaffirming his commitment to the path he had chosen. When the month ended and he returned to the camp, he carried himself with quiet confidence, unshaken by the judgment of others. To his surprise, not everyone greeted him with hostility. A few warriors, particularly younger ones who had grown weary of endless fighting, approached him privately to express their support. "You are brave," one of them said, "braver than most of us." Their words lifted his spirits, reminding him that change often starts small. He began speaking openly about his experiences, encouraging others to question the cycle of violence that had defined their lives for generations. Like Emily, he faced resistance, but also glimmers of hope. One crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after Emily's escape, something extraordinary happened. A group of settlers arrived at the edge of Apache territory, seeking permission to trade goods and establish peaceful relations. Among them was Emily, her hair tied back and her eyes bright with determination. She had convinced her father and several neighbors to join her mission, believing it was time to take the first step toward reconciliation. When Nantan heard the news, his heart raced with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He joined the delegation sent to meet the settlers, his pulse quickening as he scanned their faces. And then he saw her, standing tall and proud, clutching the wooden bird carving in her hand. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Neither moved at first, afraid that stepping forward might shatter the fragile connection between them. But then Emily broke into a wide smile, taking a hesitant step closer. Nantan followed suit, closing the distance until they stood face to face. Words failed them both, so instead, they embraced, a gesture that spoke volumes. The meeting between settlers and Apache marked the beginning of a tentative alliance. It wasn't perfect, there were still disagreements and moments of tension, but it was a start. Emily and Nantan became symbols of this new chapter, their bond serving as proof that understanding and compassion could transcend even the deepest divides. Years later, when the land had begun to heal from years of conflict, people still talked about the rancher's daughter and the Apache warrior who dared to defy their respective worlds. Their story inspired countless others to seek common ground, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, hope could take root and flourish.